The movie opens with a man named Paul hurriedly rushing out of a building and fleeing instantly. As he runs swiftly, the loud siren sounds and explosions in the background add to the already tense scene. The city is in chaos, but Paul successfully makes it out. He immediately rushes to his 2 infants whom he had kept safe in the woods, protecting them from the immense chaos in the city. He holds them tight in his arms, relieved to find them unhurt. 15 years go by, and Paul and his grown sons live on a remote farm, far from civilization. It's a post-apocalyptic world, and most of the earth has been wiped out. One evening, Paul awaits the return of his son Thomas, who has gone out. It's getting dark, and being out in the dark is life-threatening, knowing the danger that lurks. Immediately after Thomas arrives, they rush back into the house and begin to shut all the doors and windows. After Paul confirms that they're secure and safe, he announces to them that it's dinner time. At the dinner table, they say a little prayer and are ready to eat. As they begin, Paul warns Thomas about the dangers of coming home late. Thomas, immediately defensive, says he was busy helping out at the Rose farm. Paul is just looking out for his sons and wants them to stay out of harm's way. After dinner, the 2 boys sit down to play a round of chess while their father watches. Suddenly, their dog begins scratching a particular spot on the ground furiously. Paul's attention is immediately brought to the dog. The 3 are aware of the incoming danger and rush to the door. Something from outside is trying to force its way in, but Paul and Thomas are able to hold the door down until the creature gives up and leaves. Later, Paul goes to check on Joseph, who's busy at the workshop with a machine he's working on. While there, they chat a little. Despite the raging pessimism, the old man is optimistic about humanity's survival and the planet's healing. He believes other survivors would sooner or later come to their rescue. To Joseph's bewilderment, his father manages to fix the cart which he had been struggling with. Paul then teaches him how to drive it, with Thomas sitting at the back, observing the scene. After the driving lesson, Paul sends the 2 boys on an errand. He tells them to go to the river and salvage. As the 2 head to the river, a frustrated Thomas begins to complain about being stuck taking care of Joseph. He criticizes Joseph's driving skills and claims that's why their father asked them to go together, because he doesn't trust Joseph all by himself. Thomas would rather be at the Roses farm at the moment than with his brother. Joseph is offended by his words and tells him that he can go wherever he wants to if he feels stuck with him. This, however, was just bait, and Joseph unfortunately falls for his brother's manipulation. Thomas asks Joseph to drop him off while they go their separate ways, and that they should meet back there before sunset. The poor boy is terrified by the new change of plans. He anxiously watches Thomas go his separate way, with him about to continue his journey alone. On the other hand, Thomas then hurriedly makes his way to the Rose farm. At the farm, Mr. and Mrs. Rose are surprised to see him. They had thought he wasn't going to come since the day was almost over. However, there isn't much work for Thomas to do at the farm since Mr. Rose has already done his job for the day for him. He ends up spending the whole day with Mr. and Mrs. Rose's daughter, Charlotte. They play a game called Crappy Apocalypse, where each of them has to explain what happened at the end of the world in a limited time frame of 10 seconds. After they take turns to play the game, Thomas notices that a lot of time has gone by since he came to the farm, and he should be on his way home immediately. Charlotte understands that he has to leave, but he assures her that he'll be back the next day. Just as Thomas is about to leave, Charlotte calls him back, asking if he has an extra 10 seconds of his time to spare. Thomas affirms, and immediately, Charlotte rushes into his arms to embrace him. They hug for about 10 seconds and Thomas runs home. Meanwhile, Joseph, who has been by the river since, finishes doing what his father sent him to do, and makes his way to the cart. As he attempts to start the engine, it sputters, but doesn't start. Anxiety begins to kick in when Joseph has a look at the sun, and it's about to set. Poor man is running out of time. Their father, who is back at home awaiting their return, begins to get worried. After multiple attempts to start the engine of the vehicle, it finally obliges, and heaving a sigh of relief, Joseph heads home immediately. Meanwhile, Thomas, who is speedily running home, suddenly slips and falls into a ditch and lands in a cave. Talk about timing. There's a loud thud heard from the distance as he falls to the ground. Joseph arrives at the spot where he and Thomas had agreed to meet up, but there's no Thomas in sight. After waiting a while, Joseph concludes that maybe his brother has already made his way home without him. He knows he can't stay outside any longer for his safety, so he gets into the cart and drives home. Upon arriving home, Joseph learns that his brother never made it home. Paul is immediately set to go and look for him. He instructs Joseph to stay back and watch the house, and that he will return the next morning with his brother. Joseph wants to go with his father, but Paul insists that he stay back and watch the house. Joseph apologizes to his father, but Paul says that he is to blame and not him. The man leaves, and Joseph locks the door. Paul and Rocco, the dog, begin their hunt for Thomas. He eventually finds him in a cave and wonders how he ended up there. Thomas tells him that he slipped and fell. Paul makes his way to his son and immediately hugs him. He's happy to find his son safe and sound. Although he might have sustained a concussion due to the heavy fall, Paul tells him that they'll have to spend the night in the cave and then leave the next morning. The two sit in the darkness quietly, patiently waiting for the night to pass. Meanwhile, back at home, a creature is stealthily making its way into the apartment. It sees Joseph fast asleep on a chair, and so it enters the house. Unknown to the creature, it was only just walking into a trap, and Joseph had only been pretending to be asleep. As it enters the house, a large cage suddenly lands on it and traps it to the floor. We shift our focus back on Paul and Thomas, who are now at risk of danger. Some of the creatures are making their way to them from underneath the ground, and they are no longer safe where they are. Paul begins to look for a way out immediately, but unfortunately, those creatures have trapped them. He tries to use fire to attack the creatures, but gets hurt in the process and passes out. The next morning, Paul and Thomas don't return, so Joseph takes his cart and goes looking for them. As he begins his search, he finds Rocco, but his father and brother are nowhere to be found. However, Joseph continues looking. As he drives further, he finds Thomas with their unconscious father in his arms. Joseph hurriedly goes to help. Thomas tells his brother everything that happened to him, how he slipped and fell into the cave but was luckily found by their father. Despite trying to lay low for the night, the creatures unfortunately found them, and in a bid to protect them, Paul hurt himself and is now unconscious. The two team up and carry their father into the cart, which Joseph drives them home speedily with. At home, they ensure their father gets bed rest. There's nothing more they can do. The poor man is covered in blood and badly hurt. As they sit beside him, Thomas sees something covered up in a blanket. He walks up to it, curious as to what it may be, but Joseph stops him. Thomas insists on revealing what's in there, and so Joseph tells him what happened the previous night. Joseph tells his brother that he had set himself as bait to lure one of the creatures in and catch it. Thomas isn't impressed by this and claims that it was a risky move. However, Joseph is just happy it worked. As they treat their father's wounds, Joseph raises concerns about the creatures only lasting about 8 minutes when they came the previous time, which is unusual to him. He claims that that is the least amount of time they spend trying to get into the house. He also says that just 2 creatures were trying to force their way inside. Joseph finds this very strange. However, he's the only one concerned about this. Thomas isn't putting his mind into it as he suggests that the creatures were just scared. He says that a great number of the creatures did not survive him and Paul when they came to attack them in the cave the previous night. Thomas also says that those creatures hardly attack people on the Rose farm. In all of Thomas's stories, Joseph is intrigued that Thomas was able to protect himself from the creatures. Thomas reaffirms this, and even wants to go the extra mile to prove himself to his brother right there. He claims he can also defend himself against the one Joseph has locked up. Joseph tries to prevent Thomas from approaching the creature, and in the process, it gets out of the cage, frightening the two. The creature rushes to hide under the bed, and Joseph grabs a stick to defend against it. Suddenly, the creature rushes at them, but Joseph is able to pin it down while Thomas decapitates it. Joseph had trapped it because he had plans to study the creature and learn from it. Thomas then suggests that they eat it. Joseph begins to dress parts of the creature for cooking. While doing so, Thomas suggests that they take their father to the Rose farm. He claims that they have better medicine and overall health care there, but Joseph declines. Joseph claims it's a waste of time and that they won't help them. However, Thomas insists. Together, the two put their father in the cart and drive him to the Rose farm. They arrive at the farm but are immediately denied entrance. Thomas rushes to the couple at the gate and pleads with them to help him. He narrates all that had happened when he went home late and slipped and fell, causing his father to come to look for him. He also tells them that they were caught by those mean creatures and they hurt his father. Thomas pleads that they let them in and treat his father, who is currently fighting for his life. Unfortunately, Mr. and Mrs. Rose claim that they are unable to help their father. They say they have limited health care, and helping their father would be a stretch. Mr. Rose tells Thomas that his father is a strong man, and he will pull through. Charlotte, who has been there listening all along, chips in. She claims they have health care and can take Thomas and his father in, but her mother immediately shuts her out. Mrs. Rose then turns to Thomas and tells him that the only person they can accommodate is him. On hearing this, Joseph begins to walk away. Thomas follows behind. Joseph tells Thomas to go with Mr. and Mrs. Rose, as he knows that's what Thomas has always wanted. He says he doesn't blame Thomas for his decision, because anyone would want to live with them. They are a well-to-do family. However, Thomas denies this, but Joseph keeps insisting that it is and always has been Thomas's desire to stay with Mr. and Mrs. Rose. Annoyed, Thomas instantly bursts out in rage. He asks Joseph what exactly his problem is. Thomas's childish and irresponsible behavior is sickening, and so Joseph confronts him about it. He accuses Thomas of being narcissistic. He claims Thomas always wants things to go his own way and never takes responsibility for anything. Neither does he ever regard the consequences of his actions. Thomas denies this, but Joseph insists that it's all true. He even goes further to blame Thomas for their father's current condition, claiming that their father would never call Thomas out on his bad behavior. and now the poor man is going to lose his life because of him. Thomas is immediately offended, and so he attacks Joseph. He hits him across the face, telling him not to utter another word, and Joseph falls to the ground. Thomas then goes on top of him and begins to strangle him. It's an intense struggle between the two, but an enraged Thomas finally lets go of his brother and walks away. Joseph gets up from the ground, coughing as a result of his brother's tight arm around his neck for such a long time. He goes into the cart, starts the engine, and drives off. The aftermath of the situation suddenly kicks in, and Thomas makes his way back to Mr. and Mrs. Rose. The couple welcome Thomas with open arms, and Mr. Rose sympathizes with Thomas. He then instructs Charlotte to show him to his quarters and offer him something to eat. Charlotte leads Thomas inside, where she offers him food. At first, Thomas struggles to take a bite of anything, but following Charlotte's encouragement, he manages to eat. Afterwards, she takes him to his room, and there, while Thomas has a look around the place, the two talk. As they chat, Thomas opens up about his feelings toward Charlotte. He claims being with her is the only thing that makes him happy. At that moment, the two lean in for a kiss, and then Mr. Rose barges in. He sees the two in this awkward position, and before Charlotte can manage to speak, he orders her to come with him. Sometimes later, Charlotte sees Thomas snooping around the house. She inquires what the matter is, and Thomas immediately pleads for her to give him some medicine. He's afraid that he might lose his father if something isn't done sooner to save his life. Thomas's pleas are heard by Charlotte, and she gives him a small container of pills. Charlotte wonders how he will get the medicine to his father in time, as the sun is already setting, but Thomas thinks he can make it. Thomas immediately hurries out of the farm with the container of pills in his hands. Just as he's running, he's immediately stopped in his tracks by an armed employee at the farm. The man accuses Thomas of stealing, but Thomas claims he didn't steal the pills. Instead, Charlotte gave them to him. He pleads with the man to believe him. He can even ask Charlotte if he still has any doubts. However, the man tells him to follow him. This man finds Thomas guilty of not just stealing, but trying to take his job from him. He claims they were trying to replace him with Thomas at one time. The upset man takes Thomas inside, where some of his other colleagues are, and they tie him up. The man is still armed, and he points his weapon at Thomas, claiming that there's a certain punishment for liars and thieves. The man instructs Thomas to take a deep breath as he's about to pull the trigger. Thomas incessantly pleads with him, screaming for help and praying to God. The man positions himself to pull the trigger, and a loud gunshot is heard in the distance. The loud noise wakes up the couple, who are sleeping peacefully in their room. Mr. Rose gets up to check where the noise is coming from. As he looks through the window, he doesn't find anything. He tells his wife, who was also awakened by the chaos outside, that he's going outside to investigate and have a better look. He is standing by the door about to leave, when suddenly one of the creatures bursts in and begins to attack the couple. The man is almost defenseless, as this creature is double his height and on top of him. His wife, witnessing this, screams in fear, and the creature shifts its gaze to her. It then goes to attack her. Meanwhile, the curtains in the couple's room are now on fire, as the lantern in Mr. Rose's hand fell and landed on the curtains in the room, setting them ablaze. The woman is busy struggling with the creature when all of a sudden it rips apart and its bloody guts land on her face. She screams in agony, and all the chaos wakes Charlotte up. She gets up from her bed, grabs a lantern, and makes her way out of her room to inquire what all the ruckus is about. As she walks out, she sees a long trail of blood down the hallway. Charlotte begins to breathe shakily, terrified of the unknown. As she traces the blood, she finds one of the creatures in all of its gore. Charlotte lets out a scream at the sight of this. Meanwhile, it turns out Thomas was saved by the invasion of the creatures. The creatures had arrived just in time, preventing one of the workers from taking his life. However, now he needs to escape, but unfortunately, he is still tied up. He pleads with the other workers there to help him, but it's every man for himself at this point. These vile creatures are wiping out everything and everyone in their way. There's no escaping this. Thomas struggles and manages to free himself, breaking the wood that he was tied up against in the process. As he's set free, he comes face to face with one of the creatures about to attack him. Suddenly, there's a loud gunshot, and the creature falls to the ground. Thomas turns around to see who shot it, and it's Charlotte. She then grabs him by the arm, and the two escape the premises. As they come out of the building, Thomas notices that her parents' house is on fire. He hurries to the apartment, but Charlotte stops him. With tears in her eyes, she tells him that there's no need, as her parents are gone. The two then proceed to head for the exit. Meanwhile, Joseph arrives home with his father. He has locked all the doors and windows, sealing them inside. But there's a hole in the floor. He manages to seal it as well. Joseph then walks up to his unconscious father, lying on the floor, and kisses his old man on his forehead. Suddenly, there's a loud thumping in the distance. Joseph, immediately alert, goes to find out what it is. As he slowly walks to the door, a hand reaches out and slides the door open. Thomas informs his brother that it's just him, and there's no reason to fear. Joseph helps him come in and is shocked to see Charlotte with him. As they enter, Thomas hands Joseph the pills that he had collected for their father. Curious, Joseph asks if anyone else survived, to which they disaffirm. Thomas then apologizes for their fight earlier. The man, in response to his apology, says that despite their differences, he still needs his brother. At that moment, there's a cough heard coming from the other room. It's Paul. He's awake. The two boys rush to their father, happy to see him doing better. Joseph then tells his father that the creatures have dug under the house and that they plan to come up through the floors. The man, barely able to speak, weakly mutters the word "fight" to his sons. Next minute, Joseph instantly makes his way out of the house. The others, Thomas and Charlotte, wonder where he is headed, and so they follow him closely. He gets into the workshop outside and begins to start putting things together. Thomas, unaware of what Joseph is up to, helps him regardless. They gather some gallons of gasoline, and Joseph, protecting his dog Rocco, locks him up in the workshop. He asks Charlotte and Thomas to help buy him some time while he prepares a trap for the creatures in another room. While Thomas is on the lookout at the entrance, he notices that the creatures have already started making their way into the house from the hole that they dug from under. Thomas immediately goes into hiding, while Charlotte is on alert as well with her weapon in her arms. As the creature enters the apartment, Thomas sneaks up behind it to attack it, but he isn't strong enough, and so the monster wraps its arm around Thomas. Luckily, Charlotte swiftly fires, and the two run upstairs. Charlotte is worried that the house isn't well secured, but Thomas reassures her that it's all part of the plan as Joseph has set a trap for the monsters. The woman isn't convinced by this and keeps asking if it's a good plan. Suddenly, Paul barges out of his room, covered in blood and unsteady in feet. They are shocked to see him. One of the creatures had snuck into the room where Paul was asleep, but he came out triumphant. Joseph then tells his father that he has set a trap for the monsters, and there's no time to waste. The creatures are making their way to them, and Paul goes to attack them. Soon they outnumber him, and the others go to help him out. They then rush into another room, and as they walk through the door, Paul locks it from outside. Joseph calls on his dad emotionally to open the door. He knows that Paul won't survive being out there alone with the monsters. He has a plan that they could all survive, and there's no need for Paul to put his life on the line. However, Paul has made up his mind. As he walks away, he reminisces about the day he had rescued his two sons. It was 15 years ago when he held them up in his arms as infants. The explosive Joseph had set is about to go off, and Thomas reminds Joseph that they need to hide in the refrigerator, and there's nothing they can do about their father. The three rush into the refrigerator and shut the lid. Meanwhile, on the other side of the house, all the creatures come at Paul, ready to attack him. Just then, there's a loud and massive explosion. Some of the fire gets into the refrigerator where the three are hiding, but luckily, no damage is done and they survive. The explosion ends, and they all come out, with singed hair, but unharmed. As they come out, Joseph is still hopeful about their father. He rushes to look for him, but the whole house is nearly burned to the ground, and the chances of finding any living thing are slim. Joseph continues his search. All of a sudden, they hear the sound of a creature growling. This frightens them, and they instantly flee, rushing into the cart and driving away into the night. As they drive speedily, one of the creatures follows behind, but Charlotte, who is seated at the back of the cart, fires at it. They approach a blockade, and Joseph stops the cart. The next day, there's a sense of calm and relief, and the three mourn their parents. Afterwards, they plan for their future. The two brothers finally hug and forgive each other. There is a moment of closure, as Joseph even praises his brother's girlfriend. The movie finally ends, as they get into their cart and drive off, but not without Rocco, who follows speedily behind them.